ones who can't fix themselves. Blessed are the ones who know they need help. Blessed are the ones who don't have it all together. They're gonna see you come through. They're gonna see you come through.
Scriptures today, I think. The first is 1 Kings chapter 4, 29 through 34. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people in the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, children of Mahol. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Next one is Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, 38 through 42. At that time, Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." Then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah. And see, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. And see, something greater than Solomon is here." The word of God for the people of God.
So I've got a painting for you to look at today. Please, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, so I will just acknowledge it for 1 second. No, Jesus would have never been red hair and pale skinned. Okay, we're going to move on now. So this painting, though, that will get us into the conversation. So this painting here, it is from 1849 by John Everett Millais. I don't know exactly if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm going to say I am. And it's called Christ in the House of His Parents. Now that you know the title, take a look again. It was incredibly controversial for its time. I wonder why. Same reasons it would be controversial today are not the same reasons it was controversial then, right? It's mostly because of the very ordinary way that it portrays Jesus and his family. The artist set the painting in a carpenter shop that looked very much like what a carpenter shop would look like in Britain in the middle of that century. The floor is dirty. It's full of wood shavings. And his friend, the painter's friend, William Holman Hunt, even wrote about his friend's process of painting this, where he would go and spend day after day after day in this cold carpenter shop on Oxford Street in London, just sketching it out over and over again, balling it up, throwing it away, sketching it out, sketching it out. The writer Charles Dickens penned a scathing review of this painting. He had a magazine called Household Words, and in 1850, he wrote some words. He says, "It's a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-haired boy in a nightgown who appears to have received a poke plane in an adjacent gutter, and to a holding it up to the for contemplation of a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that supposing it were possible for any human creature to exist for a moment with that dislocated throat, she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest Cabernet of France, or, it's crazy." He goes on to talk a little bit about how Mary looks like she's an alcoholic in the painting, and calls Jesus this blubbering redhead gutter snipe. I think gutter snipe, I'm imagining, is like poor trash, right? So what do you see in this painting? In the details, you can see Jesus' cut hand. Perhaps, the guy wasn't trying to say he was multi-layered, right? Had a cut hand, maybe for foreshadowing something about the cross. Mary offers a kiss on his cheek. Notice Mary doesn't look much older than Jesus himself. In this detailed painting, you can see Jesus' grandmother, Mary's mother, working in the shop. And Anna's using a pair of pliers to pull out the offending nails that had pierced her grandson's hand a few minutes before, because, Lord only knows what he had gotten into. Joseph is making a door, which is laid out on the carpentry work table, and he reaches out tenderly to touch his son's wound. He's got just another day with another boo-boo, right? Can you see the wooden triangle over Jesus' head? Maybe the other one. Yeah, see that wooden triangle over Jesus' head? Some people say it's a symbol of the Trinity. It could have been an old, replica of some kind of protractor. It's a carpentry shop after all. And then the next image after that, you have the boy. This one, that's right. The boy on the right is perhaps John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, because they're living in full households, right? So that gives some perspective a little bit to Jesus as an older man going to see John. Maybe at one point in time they lived together. He's carrying water. This could be a reference, maybe, if there was deeper meaning, to washing the disciples' feet, or foreshadowing John will baptize Jesus. I mean, it could be, or it could just be what it is. They dress John in camel's hair. Look over to the left of the same image, and you'll see Jesus' right foot has like a dot of blood on it. Could be he stubbed his toe, or stepped on that nail, the same nail he got a boo-boo from. Could be foreshadowing something more. Some art academics have suggested the man on the left represents Jesus' future self. Or some others have said this represents Jesus' future apostles or followers. There's sheep in the background, pretty ordinary thing. Or it could be the flock of Jesus' followers. You tell me. And apparently a butcher shop, there might be, somebody says that they've seen in the background maybe a butcher shop, and so those sheep might have, impending doom awaiting them. The basket that someone is in the process of weaving, there's a basket there. And so there's all these little elements that make it very ordinary. There's a blogger who said that Christ in the house of his parents was the painter's response to the time in which he lived in England, a time when spirituality was facing a severe threat as social conditions were worsening, and the gap between the rich and the poor grew wider. And so to place Jesus in a setting so ordinary was an affront. Tells you a little bit about Dickens, right? Dickens also had his own story to tell too, related to that. And then finally, this would have been in the actual museum where this painting is hung. The last image is that they would have had them next to each other, the original drawings and the painting that came to be. And if you put them next to each other, if you were to study it for a long time, you'd notice they're different in that even last minute, the painter is making last minute decisions on whether it will be Mary who kisses Jesus or Jesus who kisses Mary, right? For about 30 years, the majority of Jesus' earthly life was ordinary. Spent growing up in this small Jewish town of Nazareth. And throughout the Gospels, it focuses on his public ministry, right? But there are these two spans of time where we get nothing about his life. We get one little glimpse when he's like 12 to 13 years old. It's a glimpse that parents love to read, though I'm not sure why, because they end up finding the kid who's lost, their son Jesus, in the temple. Tell me if that's where your kid would be, if you had lost your kid for three days, right? Probably not. But parents love this because it gives a little glimpse into the parenthood of Jesus. Jesus was a boy, right? He was a boy. He did mischievous things. And so between birth and that moment, and then that moment and then getting Jesus at 30 years old, we have nothing. But there's things that we can make sense of. We can kind of piece together from the parts of Scripture we have and from assumptions we can make about that community at that time. We can know that Jesus was a part of a large family, a large, close-knit Jewish family. He was the oldest of all of the 7 children, which included his brothers, James and Joses and Jude. Joses is like the version of Joseph, but for a little boy. That's what you would call the namesake, right? But if they're a little boy. Jude, Simon, and he had at least 2 sisters, which, if you count those, leaves some questions on a name. For 7, we're not exactly sure if we have all the names. His home life was simple, and it would have been devout, and he would have had responsibilities in the household. Joseph and Mary would have expected something of him. He was the oldest son. Manual labor would have been a part of their life. He learned the trade of carpentry from his parents, from his dad, and the tradition, I believe, would be he's the oldest son, so what was expected of him? To take over the family business, right? This is physically demanding blue-collar job that involved working with both wood and stone. Religious life, as a devout Jewish boy, Jesus would have learned from the Hebrew Scriptures. In the synagogue, would have gone to the synagogue week after week with his family, and he would have participated in the rhythms of worship and festivals. Festivals would have defined their calendar of life. He would not have spoken Hebrew, as I said. He would have maybe heard it, but not spoken it. His parents would have called him some affectionate version of Isho or Eshu, the Aramaic. Being fully human, Jesus would have experienced this full range of human growth and all of its frailties. He would have walked and talked like us. He would have had moments of rebellion. He would have had awkward moments as he came into his body. He would have had things he didn't like to eat and things he loved and asked for from his parents all the time. He would have disobeyed at moments. That one little glimpse, I feel like we want it to be, that little glimpse of 12 years old, we want it to be this like real moment, and then we find Jesus in the temple and we realize it's not as real, right? These ordinary years, they built up his character and formed him in meaningful ways and gave him the language of his faith and the experiences all around Nazareth would have informed the way he talked about his faith later on, like yours do. Ordinary terms like seeds and fruit and vineyards and laborers and workers and harvests and yeast and bread and communal dinners, and which later became the language he used, right? To speak and teach and preach and parables that brought the extraordinary message of God into the ordinary existence of people, right? And in every way you could imagine in the context of your life and how that impacts how you would speak and eat and act and interact with those around you, Jesus' life was the same. Just as every day, just as on the ground, just as ordinary. But the question you asked, I actually don't know which one of you asked this question. It was anonymous, so I don't know. The question you asked, who was this ordinary Jesus guy, was only half of your question. You also asked, how does this compare to the way that Jesus is portrayed across religious traditions, the people of the book, or the Abrahamic faiths, we call them, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. If you didn't know, they all are intertwined and share passages, scripture together. They share core themes of what it means to be a faithful person as well. Within all of their imams and rabbis, both traditions have a long list of imams and rabbis who have written about the significance of Jesus. Some kicked out of those traditions. Some starting whole new faiths out of those traditions. But before we talk about that, let's zoom in for a second, or zoom out away from Jesus for a second and just talk about those three traditions, and as a whole, as a part of also the wider kind of faith, multiple, we can put up all of them right now, beyond those three. One of the things that unites all religions, before there were written scriptures, religious ideas were transmitted orally, right? And before the existence of religions we know today, gather hunters and tribal communities would gather around fire and share stories about mysterious forces that they're noticing that had the power to affect the living world around them. And the stories of those indigenous cultures that predate even modern religion often featured animals that would embody those virtues, right? As time went on, supernatural took a very human form, and different religions evolved. And in those that exist today, there is this key similarity, this one thing that unites all of them, and it's the way that they tend to speak to their believers. And that is in parables of taking the ordinary context of their world and the language of their world and making them tell the story of the extraordinary, used in every one of these traditions. From the Bible to the Quran to Buddhist sutras, in Christianity, Jesus often used parables. We know that. The Prophet Muhammad also used parables to explain complex theological concepts to his followers. The parable of the blind man is one of the ones that is known well, or of the garden within that tradition. And they have mimicking parables to our parable of the Good Samaritan, mimicking parables of our parable of the prodigal son, ones that look very similar to ours. Buddha frequently used parables to teach his followers of the nature of suffering and the path of enlightenment. Hinduism draws upon this rich tradition of parables and stories. This one Hindu epic, Ramayana, it underscores kind of the importance of loyalty and devotion and selflessness. All themes we find in our own faith. The Baha'i faith also places great emphasis on the use of parables, all of them. All of these traditions believe that stories can change the way we think, which is why all religions rely on story, on myths, on parables. Here are just a few. Let's get a glimpse of across the Abrahamic traditions of some of these parables. Okay, we got the Christian one first, right? Jesus spoke this parable about the mustard seed, right? Then we can move on to the Quran. This one The likeness of those who spend their wealth in Allah's way is as the likeness of a grain which groweth 7 years. 7 years, and every year 100 grains. It's so reminiscent of another verse we have. Or in the Talmud, the Jewish text, we get, consider the king who has lost a gold coin or a precious pearl in his house. May he not find it by the light, a wick worth no more than an isar? Likewise, do you not, the parable, appear of little worth to you by its light? A man can fathom words of the Torah. The smallest thing becomes the biggest thing, right? We have that. It's so similar to our mustard faith parable. Which brings me to our scripture for today, a story that holds significance across all three Abrahamic traditions of faith and gets us to the real, why does this matter piece of Jesus' humanity. It's the story of King Solomon, a story that's this meaningful part of Christianity, this meaningful part of Judaism, this meaningful part of Islam. Solomon was known for his supernatural wisdom. Did you hear it as Phoebe read? In fact, he's known for having written an entire book in the Bible, sometimes called the Wisdom of Solomon, but we know it as the Proverbs. Proverbs, and that's why we always are Proverbs sound like Confucius. It's because of this long history of every faith using parables, right? This is a language that was spoken long before Christianity. So Solomon, let's try to understand him for a little bit. And we'll start with the Queen of Sheba. Queen of Sheba was in about modern day Ethiopia. And she had heard of this reputation of Solomon, of this Jewish king living in Jerusalem, reigning in Jerusalem, how there didn't seem to be a thing, not a thing at all, that he could not explain. He just spoke circles around everyone. And often people were left completely dazzled and also totally confused. He would say things like, you've heard it said, and then he would give a new explanation for how to understand the workings of the world around him. So she decided to make that trek. It was 1,200 miles, 1,200-mile journey to Jerusalem to see if he really was as wise as he had been known to be. And she said, I have a feeling like I can, at the least, I can have a little intellectual challenge here. But she was pretty darn sure she could dupe him, that she could manipulate him to not have all the words that he had been known to have. So she takes Solomon on in this kind of chess game of conversation. Solomon's court is arranged, and she kind of watches how all of these servants and this whole system works effortlessly around him. And she brought gifts for him. And in 1 Kings, later on in the story, it says that Solomon answered all her questions, all of them, every single one. And when the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the place that he had built, she was breathless, it says. It had just knocked the breath out of her. She was stunned. Now you have to know how infrequently that happens in life, how rare it is, the rarity that something exceeds our expectations that much, and especially for this woman. It doesn't happen often, but it happened in this case, and the breath was taken out of her because of this king. The report I heard in my country, she says, about your achievements and your wisdom, they're all true. And I'm amazed by them. Solomon had this way of telling a good story, right? He could just tell a good story. You know those people that are effortless with their words. I wish I could be one of the people who it came effortless without having to write it down first. I'm not one of those. I have to really spend time crafting my words ahead of time. So if I go into a conflict or something without having done that, it's never going to go well, right? He was just effortless. It was effortless. And this is why in the course of history, Jesus, when Jesus comes along and had the same way, this effortless storytelling, this effortless way of explaining the workings of the world, people of no faith, people of faith, they immediately recognized him as doing the same as Solomon, especially within the Abrahamic tradition. If Solomon was known for his wisdom, surely Jesus was too, right? What a wise guy, that Jesus. What a sage. What a prophet. I mean, Jesus seemed like the wisest guy who had ever lived. And so while they were not interested in Jesus being God, traditions like Judaism and Islam and various rabbis and imams within those traditions have always been willing to engage his teaching as this ancient sage, Jesus the sage. After all, our culture, whole civilizations have been built largely on the principles espoused by Jesus, right? The religious traditions, the religious traditions that those principles emerged out of have forgotten how often whole civilizations have been built on the principles derived out of our faith. And while Judaism has largely ignored the miracles of Jesus, Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, wrote clearly that Jesus had existed, had this way of speaking wisely for the world, of saying things that were important, of teaching compassion and teaching mercy, and all that's necessary for moral and just societies. And there were many rabbis, many of which have been kind of denounced by parts of the Jewish faith. Many rabbis who said, hey friends, we should spend more time reading Jesus. Additionally, in the Quran and the Islamic tradition, takes Jesus as this sage thing to this next level, makes Jesus, gives him the title of miracle worker, prophet. Just like Solomon's wisdom came supernaturally, the kind of wisdom that Solomon and Jesus had, both of them, it was supernatural in origin, something otherworldly, they noticed. Both humans had been blessed by God to speak the divine in ordinary bodies, living ordinary lives among us, and to help pivot us towards God. And what was the crux of this wisdom? Just like the painter of Jesus' family, just like many of the stories of Charles Dickens. The origin of this language always seems to major on and unites all of these traditions, major on these kind of three virtues of compassion and mercy and grace. Who was Jesus the human? He was compassionate, merciful, grace-filled. Every parable, every single story that rose time and time again, every one tucked in someone's pocket and retold at the next gathering around table or fireside, was something that talked about the heart of God and about God's compassion and God's mercy and God's grace. Islam and Christianity both inherited this from Judaism. All these moral ties, all these shared values. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than this. Paul goes on to write, love is patient, love is kind. The Hebrew prophets speak of this love, of this justice and righteousness that flows down, mercy like ever-flowing streams. Christian social values, while centrally based on this cardinal principle of love, also carry over many of the ethical precepts found in Judaism and in Islam. Having faith in God is directly related then to one's ability to live with compassion and mercy and justice, compassion, mercy, and grace with others. This is who Jesus is. What we get, though, at the end of our reading today is it revisits the story of Solomon. I don't know if you heard it. As Phoebe read, it revisited the story of Solomon and said, but this one, after Jesus has just called out and called people to account in their compassion and their mercy and their grace, speaks of Solomon's wisdom, and oh, how Solomon stood out among the rest as being wiser than any. But Jesus, it says, maybe it's the fourth of the scriptures. We can put that one up. It says, but see, something greater than Solomon is here. This is the unique thing about Jesus. The thing that transcends in traditions that don't acknowledge him as the Son of God. There's still this acknowledgement, right, of the way he lived in the world with compassion and mercy and grace. These three things are different, right? The grace is defined as kind of the unmerited favor of God towards us. Mercy is God's compassion and forgiveness extended to sinners. And then compassion is a reflection of God's love and is expected of us, right? It's how we live out. It's how we live out God's mercy and grace, is by offering compassion. There's grace, which is all God. Mercy, God's extension to us. And then compassion, the way we live out God's grace and mercy in the world. Mercy also we see is also this kind of justice word, right? This is how justice gets mixed into this as well. I once had a conversation, as the band comes forward, I once had a conversation with, in an interfaith setting, where there was an imam there and a rabbi there, and I was actually observing, but there was also a Catholic priest, and they were having a conversation about these three words and how they appear in their faith. And it's the thing that leaves me breathless when I think about Jesus, the significance of Jesus being human, but also the significance that we, as the Christian faith, believe that Jesus' wisdom is something more, something greater. I think about that day because while they all had a word for grace in all of their languages, the imam and the rabbi both agreed together. They didn't have a way to talk about it in modern day in their faith. They all had a word for it. They all agreed that those definitions were the same, and all majored on compassion and mercy and justice in the world, being people that had empathy, people who cared more about themselves, who cared less about themselves and more for the other. But when it came to the word grace, they got lost. They didn't have a language for it. So what's so significant about Jesus being human? Jesus lived that life. But more than anything, Jesus died, rose again, comes to set a feast for us that we'll share at this table. And in that, we get a picture of unmerited favor that no other faith can describe. Which is God. That's God. That's a glimpse of the divine for us. We should be grateful for it. We should stand in awe of it. It should leave us breathless. Let's pray.